You're watching BionicDance. Don't run on automatic, instead, please think.
Today we're going to revisit the definition of atheism as a lack of belief in God, specifically to look at why it's so controversial.
Oh, I can tell you why it's so controversial in just a few seconds. Because each side in the atheism-theism debate will have a much harder to defeat argument if they can force the other side to use their definition. The problem is that all of this fight is over a word that, unfortunately, can have two etymologies, and thus two definitions, while still being spelled and pronounced exactly the same way. Let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers. BionicDance here. Today we're dealing with a fellow who goes by the rather unfortunate moniker of Missing the Mark. I have no idea how anybody could think that's a good name to use while debating. Regardless, we're once again dredging up that old chestnut about the definition of atheism. The guy goes on at length, nearly 12 minutes, on what should be a very simple topic. We'll have to see just how much I'm willing to cover and how much is actually quite superfluous.
You can see the traditional definition in the word's etymology. Atheism. Atheos meaning without God, and the ism suffix denoting a belief system.
And this is where we run into our first stumbling block, because both A and ism express multiple concepts, similar but different, and too many people, mostly theists, insist we're only allowed to use one. For example, A can mean both not and without. No part of it actually means the explicit and knowing denial that we're expected to use. Furthermore, ism can mean an explicitly held belief system, that's where the explicit and knowing part comes from, but it can also mean simply a state of being. So to define atheism as a belief system that explicitly denies God ignores the very relevant and legitimate possible definitions of the word. It's much the same as the common usage of phobia to only mean fear or hatred, when it can also be interpreted to mean aversion. Another relevant issue is the etymology. It's perfectly legitimate to, instead of atheos-ism, to use the etymology A-Theism, being without theism. Unfortunately, when you compress both etymologies, they come out to the same word, atheism.
Words cannot be defined correctly or incorrectly, but they can be defined usefully or uselessly. And more to the point here, they can be defined in good faith, clearly, to aid mutual understanding, or in bad faith, cleverly, in order to disguise a rhetorical trick.
And here is where the second problem comes in, because neither side agrees on what the rhetorical trick is and who is using one.
And that second one is why atheism as lack of belief is so controversial. If atheism merely denoted a psychological state, which might in fact be common between the atheist and a dead rat, no one would much care.
Well, so what if nobody would care? That's got nothing to do with it. Maybe you're looking for an explicit position to debate, but I and many others are looking for a way to accurately describe something. And it is important to have the atheism definition, because atheism can come in many different styles and to many different degrees. To have a description that covers all of those bases is important in order to express one's actual opinion. Some people want the word to do too much heavy lifting, to exclusively and without exception describe a state which goes far beyond the etymology, namely the sticking point of atheism being denial and denial only, which, as I pointed out, is not the only etymology or definition one could use, and insisting on that exclusive definition gives us no way to describe the several other flavors in which not believing in any gods can come.
Merely lacking a belief isn't what lack of belief atheists actually mean. They only talk about lacking a belief to distract from the positive assertion they've learned to say quickly and quietly, that in default of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, one should assume atheism in the old sense.
And this is where the rhetorical trickery comes in, and not from the atheist. You're telling us what our position is, and then expecting us to defend the stance we've been assigned. That's a straw man fallacy, and it's terrible debating technique. The fact is that the atheists are not doing this. As I said, the preferred definition is simply one that describes the state of having no belief in any gods, and it can include those ignorant of the concept, those who just don't care, and those who've made an exhaustive study of the matter. But that doesn't mean that using this definition is being used to escape a position. There is more to it than that. So what do we do about this? If we cannot agree on a definition, and the ones we're forced to use have the same spelling and pronunciation, how do we distinguish between the two concepts? Do we try to find a new word for one of them? I've heard people propose using non-theist, but non and a mean the same thing. The difference is that one is Latin and the other is Greek. The solution I've proposed, one that many people seem weirdly averse to using, is to use the A-Theism definition in order to explicitly separate the two demographics, believers and non-believers, and then, this is the radical part, use adjectives to further describe the two. Explicit atheist versus implicit atheist, strong atheism versus weak atheism, Gnostic atheism versus agnostic atheism, and such like. Now we've covered all of our bases. If theists so desperately want to argue against only the explicit, strong atheism, by all means, but stop pretending that it's the only form atheism can come in, and stop insisting that the word can only mean one of them. We're not using a rhetorical trick. We're just trying to use language that can go more in depth than the definition you prefer, a definition that is a rhetorical trick designed to force us to defend a position we may not hold.
I'd like to note the subtle move of people who have more or less explicitly adopted a controversial definition of atheism in order to cover for explicitly begging the question. I suspect that this is more accidental than intentional, somewhat evolutionary, where one lack of belief atheist did it and it worked and caught on by imitation, but it's a highly effective rhetorical trick. Put all your effort into defending something not very important, and people will ignore your real weakness.
The controversial definition of atheism is the extremely limited one you're proposing. Suppose my reason for not believing in a God is because the people proposing one have failed to successfully make their case. Suppose my reason for not believing is, as you suggested earlier, exhaustive study of the matter. Suppose my reason for not believing is because I will not engage in faith, demanding objective, independently verifiable evidence instead. Suppose my reason for not believing in a God is because the descriptions of them sound like a bad Dungeons and Dragons adventure. Suppose my reason for not believing in a God is because I was raised in a culture that didn't have such legends, and so I'm ignorant of the concept. Or any other number of reasons. Maybe I just don't give a shit. The definition you prefer covers maybe one or two of those, and definitely excludes a few. What is your solution to that problem, if expanding the definition of atheism to fit is unacceptable?
So, how reasonable is this assumption? The best argument I've ever heard for it is that in ordinary life, we always assume that things don't exist until we have evidence for them. This is, properly speaking, something only idiots do. For example, oh look, here's a hole in the ground. I'm going to assume it's empty. It might be empty, of course, but in ordinary life, only candidates for the Darwin Awards assume that.
This analogy with the whole assumes that atheists have abandoned skepticism in favor of making just as much a faith assertion as your own that a God does exist. And that's simply not the case. Unless we've got evidence for the existence of a God, like evidence for something being in that hole in the ground, I do not assume that something is or is not present, and I will check to make sure before making an explicit statement. In other words, I'm a skeptic. I don't claim on faith that there are no gods. I say only that I do not believe in any. I'm pretty convinced that the gods I've been told about are bullshit because their existence has been proposed without evidence, demanding faith instead of providing data, and because their scriptures are usually full of plot holes, contradictions, and verifiably false historical claims. But I am leaving my eyes and ears open for a God that can be proved. But until one can be shown to me, I remain a non-believer. I remain not a theist. I remain an atheist. Do you begin to see the point of that definition? It really is doing nothing more than saying I am not part of the group that qualifies as theists. Many people liken it to not being a stamp collector. All I have to do to be a non-stamp collector is to not collect stamps. Full stop. Nothing else is required. And it's the same with being an atheist and belief in gods.
The only possible reason to try to find something is because you think it might be there.
Or because you hope it's there. And some people go looking into the unknown to see what is there with no prior assumptions or hopes. The more I listen, the more I see some rather startling limits to this guy's thinking.
If you should act like planets in other solar systems don't exist unless someone has already given you evidence for them, you wouldn't point telescopes at them to see if they're there. Which
is an analogy that's got things backward. Theists are telling us that gods are there. and then giving us nowhere to point our metaphorical telescopes to find them, telling us to instead effectively use our imagination, disguising it, trying to make it sound more plausible, by calling it faith. And this is the part where I'm just plain done with this guy. The rest of his video is mostly idiotic analogies that he uses as straw man arguments, all of which deserve variations on the explanations I've already given for skepticism and critical thinking. To put it bluntly, he may not be an idiot, but he's definitely a fool. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please, think. People not subscribing to BionicDance is one sign of the apocalypse. Save us all. Subscribe now.